A room called Sin. This isn't too bright for you, is it, Malcolm? The disembodied voice filled the whiteness of the room. It fell like a whisper on Malcolm's ears, as if a friend had leaned in to tell him a secret. What is... Where am I? He muttered, his eyes squinted as he came around from sleeping. Hello, Malcolm, responded the voice. Where am I? He asked, his eyes beginning to search the room for a doorway. But there wasn't one. No doors, no windows, nothing. Not that he could see, at least. Not in this blinding light. He picked himself up and laid his hand against the wall to steady himself, immediately turning his gaze toward his fingers. What is this? It's not cold, not warm either. It felt like nothing at all. The wall had absolutely no texture under his fingertips and made no sound as he gently dragged his nails down its surface. His brow furrowed as he turned to look around the room again, his eyes beginning to adjust to the whiteness. A chair. There, in the middle of the room, with a table in front of it, both of them painted white. How had he not noticed them before? It must have been the brightness. He slowly moved over to the table, placing a finger on its edge. It felt cold, like metal. At least my fingers aren't numb anymore, he thought to himself, as he pulled back the chair and sat down. He pulled the chair forward, his eyes landing on a white folder placed on the table, labelled Malcolm James Miller. His eyes narrowed a little as he pulled it closer, staring at his name on the document before looking around the room again. What is this? He asked. Your case file, answered the voice. Everything we have on you from day one until now. Malcolm's eyes gazed back down to the folder, and he placed 2 fingers on it, pushing it away to the other side of the desk. I want a lawyer. His posture changed, leaning back against the chair, arms folded. We all want a lot of things, retorted the voice with an apparent sarcasm. Doesn't mean we're going to get them. Malcolm snorted a little under his breath, rolling his eyes as his eyelids closed for an emphatic blink. Well then, I've got nothing more to say. There was no response, only a faint hum coming from outside the room, like a distant air conditioning unit. He hadn't noticed that sound until now. Let me be clear, the voice perked up. No one knows that you're here. Not your lawyer, not your aunt, and certainly not Kathy Waite. Malcolm's eyes darted up, his eyebrow nerve twitching a little as he abruptly stopped picking at a grain of sand under his cracked fingernail. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself before anything came out. He looked down, noticing his left leg bouncing anxiously. He stopped it. He glanced up at the folder on the table again, then away from it. Something then caught his attention. A grate in the corner of the room near the ceiling, painted white like everything else. It looked like some sort of speaker. He pushed his chair back and stood up, walking across the room to take a closer look. As he looked closer at the grate, the voice boomed out, startling him. Look at the file. He took a step back, still looking up at the grate. Sure enough, it was where the voice was coming from. The room wasn't as strange as it initially felt. Basically just a regular interrogation room painted white, he thought to himself. He glanced back at the table, then did a double take as his heart skipped a beat. The file was now open. It couldn't have blown open. There was no draft in the room. But there it was, laying open in the dead center of the table, exposing multiple pages and photos inside, arranged in groups with paper clips, keeping each bundle separate, but together. He suddenly felt cold, looking at them, like he couldn't move. His eyes began searching the room again for the outline of a door, a handle of some kind. Then he noticed something. A hole. A small, circular hole in the wall directly across from the table, no bigger than a finger's width. Its blackness stood out like a sore thumb in the middle of the white wall. How had he not noticed before now? His head stooped a little as he stepped closer to it, trying to get a glimpse of what was behind it. He couldn't see anything, just darkness. He edged closer and placed his hand on the wall, peering into the hole but not wanting to get too close to it. Are you watching me? He barked at the hole, pausing for some kind of response. Of course, the voice responded from the speaker. We've been watching you for some time now, Malcolm. Malcolm itched his side nervously as he stared up at the speaker. The humming seemed to have gone away now. He hadn't noticed its absence. It was annoying at first, but now he almost missed it. It had become familiar, almost soothing. "And what do you want?" he piped up at the speaker, his lips peeling apart as he uttered the first word. He hadn't noticed how dry they were until then, dry like a desert. "What I want is irrelevant," the voice stated back in a matter-of-fact tone. "We are here because you are guilty. You already know what of, as do I. What we are here for is simple. Your confession." "I'm not confessing to anything, because I didn't do anything," Malcolm shouted at the speaker. "And you've got nothing on me, so cut the bullshit. Whatever you think you have won't stand up in any court because I haven't done anything." The room fell silent again as Malcolm caught his breath, his lip quivering a little, still staring at the speaker for some kind of response. "What makes you think we're interested in court?" the voice responded. Malcolm's heart went cold for a moment. "What?" he mumbled, picking at his fingernail with his thumb again. "You're not here to go to court, Malcolm. You're here to face justice." Malcolm swayed a little, his knees suddenly feeling a little off. "What do you mean, justice?" he asked. "That's what courts are for, isn't it?" "Not really," the voice replied. "They offer a facade of justice, a cheap veneer designed to keep the masses from revolting against those in power. The same justice system that awards higher penalties to those who defraud the government than to someone who molests a child and destroys their chances of having a normal life." Malcolm's breathing began to feel shallow, and the wall suddenly seemed closer, like the room was constricting around him. "Malcolm," the voice barked, slicing through Malcolm's spinning thoughts and seemingly making the room fall silent again. "You have 3 chances to confess to what you did. If you do not confess, you will be executed on the 3rd strike." Malcolm's face went pale, a sick feeling welling up in his stomach as he backed up against the wall. He wanted to say something, anything, but in that moment no words would come out. He felt powerless, trapped, even more so than before. "I didn't do anything," he screamed at the speaker. The room fell silent again. A loud alarm bellowed out of the speaker, drenching the walls in deep red light as the entire cell became tinted in the ominous hue. Suddenly the noise stopped, and the room returned to white. Malcolm's eyes wide open in fear as he clutched at his clothes, his breathing shallow and his heart racing. "Strike 1, the voice uttered calmly. Then, nothing. Malcolm half expected officers of some kind to burst through a non-existent door and carry him away. But that didn't happen. No one came bursting in. Instead, there was a faint pattering sound, almost like rain, but much softer and quieter. He held his breath for a moment, looking around the room to locate the sound. He took a step forward, hunching over a little to try and hear it more clearly. 1 step forward, another to the left. It was getting a little louder, but still faint and soft. His eyes raised toward the speaker again, then back to the desk, where the file still laid open. He blinked and turned away, then looked up, suddenly remembering something. The hole! His head darted left to look back at the hole in the wall, and there it was. A stream of pure white sand, pouring through the hole and down onto the floor. He scrambled to cover the hole, stuffing the palm of his hand over the opening. But the sand wouldn't stop, still spilling out past his hand and beginning to accumulate into a substantial pile on the floor at his feet. Without thinking, he rammed his finger into the hole, and the sand stopped. He let out a relieved sigh and rested his forehead against the wall. But then the sound began again. He could hear it coming from behind him. Malcolm turned to see where it was coming from. There, the opposite side of the room, behind the chair, another hole pouring sand into the cell. His eyes darted down to his finger, still plugging the hole, and then back to the second hole. He had to think. He looked down at his clothes and quickly began tearing at the sleeve of his shirt, ripping out a strip to scrunch up into a ball. He smushed it up as densely as possible in his hand and quickly pulled his finger back out of the hole, replacing it with a ball of cloth. It worked! The sand had stopped. He rushed over to the other side of the room and began tearing at his sleeve again, repeating the procedure a second time, and it worked once more, stopping up the flow of sand. He stepped back, cracking the faintest smile of relief, then turning back toward the speaker, as if waiting for some kind of response. Suddenly, the first cloth plug burst out of its hole and sand began gushing over the floor again. He rushed to grab it and plug the flow again, but he couldn't find the cloth. His hands searched frantically through the sand to find it, but it was gone. Then the second plug followed suit, bursting out and allowing the sand to flow freely once more. Malcolm scrambled across the room to try again, but to no avail. The cloth was simply gone, as if it were never there to begin with. He quickly began pulling at his shirt again to replace them, but it wouldn't tear. No matter how hard he pulled, the cloth just wouldn't rip. He grunted in frustration as he began pulling at his pants instead, but they wouldn't break either. He had to think of something, and fast. It had only been a few minutes, but already the sand was covering his feet. This is impossible, he thought. The sand will stop if you confess to what you did, the voice suddenly interjected. Malcolm's head spun around to look at the speaker again. I didn't do anything, he screamed at the grate, picking up the chair and hurling it across the room at the voice. The red glare flashed, and loud buzzer sounded a second time as the chair bounced off the wall with a dull thud and fell to the floor, its landing cushioned by the sand. Malcolm went to step forward but was stopped in his tracks by something. He looked down to see the sand around his legs, now as high as his knees and rising fast. He pulled his legs out one after the other and knelt on the sand, his eyes darting around the room to look for some solution, some way out. There had to be one. He crawled over to the table, getting to his feet on top of it, the sand now mere inches away from covering it. He looked down at the file, still open on the table, and kicked it across the room. It slapped the wall and sent the papers flying across the sand. He straightened up, his hair grazing the ceiling of the cell. "Why are you doing this to me?" he yelled at the speaker. "We've already been through this," the voice replied in a nonchalant manner, falling silent again. Malcolm looked hurriedly around the room again in a last-ditch attempt at finding a way out. Then something caught his eye. The outline of a door. He scrambled on his hands and knees toward it, trying to dig away the sand from around the crack in the door. How hadn't he seen the door this whole time? But it was useless. For every handful of sand that he pulled away, more poured into its place. He slumped back, sitting on the rising bed of sand around him in defeat, and wiped his brow. He looked over at the scattered papers and pictures from the folder and picked one up. A photograph of a little girl sat at a dinner table, smiling at her birthday cake with 6 lit candles atop of it. Malcolm stared at the photo for what seemed to be an eternity, with the only sound coming from the soft rustling of the rising sand around him. He lowered the photo and looked back down at the sand, now less than 4 feet from the ceiling. Bowing his head, he calmly spoke. "I confess. I killed Kathy Waite. I raped her, and I murdered her." A tear rolled from Malcolm's eye down the side of his face as he laid there, the sand now almost completely covering him. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, closing his eyes and resigning himself to his fate. The voice wafted into his ear once more. "Then you should have told her parents that before you killed yourself." Malcolm's eyes flew open in shock as he gasped his last breath, screaming into the sand as it poured down his throat, succumbing to the blinding white light of death. Then a voice spoke. "This isn't too bright for you, is it, Malcolm?"